In this lesson, we're going to use the spending allocation model, SAM, to analyze what's happening in the economy with respect to consumption, investment, net exports, and government purchases. Remember, we thought about total spending as consumption plus investment plus net exports, and that when we added government purchases, we got GDP. And then we divided those by GDP, we got the sum of spending shares, and if you think of those as in fractions, they must equal 1, or in percentages, they must equal 100. You also can think about taking the government purchases share and move it over on the other side of the equation. And now what we have on the left side is we have all the private spending, consumption, investment, net exports. And on the right, we have kind of what's left over after government purchases are taken out. It's really the 1 minus G over Y is the non-government side. It's kind of like supply. Supply of GDP that's available for the private sector after the government sector has determined what should be spent. Left-hand side, we've argued, depends negatively on the interest rate, and that's because each component depends negatively on the interest rate. Consumption, investment, and net exports each individually depend negatively on the interest rate, and so the sum does as well. So what we're going to argue is that we can find an interest rate that satisfies that equation that the left must equal to the right, and from that we're going to find out what the individual components are, consumption, investment, and net exports. So those last two bullets that you can see here, find the interest rate to satisfy that equation, and then find the components is what we're going to do now, and we're going to use some nice, simple graphs to show that. We derive the fact that consumption, investment, and net exports depends negatively on interest rate, and these graphs just illustrate that in a generic sense. We also noted that we can sum those three, consumption, investment, and net exports, horizontally in this picture, as it shows in this picture. And on the right, we get a downward sloping line illustrated in red now, which is really how the sum of those depend negatively on the interest rate. Now we want to think of that as a demand curve. And the natural definition of supply is really what is left over for the private sector to spend after government has taken it. So the rationale here is that if we draw a vertical line, which is the blue line, and that represents the share that's really left over after government takes its share, then that's what's available to the private sector. So just for example, if government purchases is 20% of GDP, we'll draw that line at 80%. It's what's left over. It's the part that government does not purchase. And we're going to think about that diagram over on the right now in a little more detail, and then come back and find out what it implies for the diagrams on the right. So here's the diagram that was on the right. There you have that downward sloping demand for C plus I plus X, the sum of those, and the vertical line is what's left over after government purchases. I gave an example where it was drawn at 80 if government purchases was 20. If you can think of a change in government purchases, then you want to look at the long run effects. Basically, we want to look at the long run effects of a change in government purchases and see how that works. The long run could be 5 years, we're not exactly sure. We want to think of it at least long lasting, not necessarily permanent, but some kind of an increase in government purchases as a share of GDP. So how do we illustrate that? Well, we do that by shifting over the line, the blue line, the supply line, in the leftward direction, because if there's more spent by government as a share of GDP, then there's going to be less by the private sector. Okay, so we just shift that supply curve. It's vertical because it's not depending on the interest rate. We're assuming that the government's decisions depend on the importance of national defense or public goods or externalities, all the rationales we consider for government purchases. And the interest rate is not a factor we're going to stress at this point, so it's a vertical line. We shift it over to the left, and we're going to have a prediction of a new interest rate. You can think about the position of the line originally. It would be at the intersection there. That's where it was at the point before we increased government purchases. We increased government purchases, shift that line to the left, and we predict that the interest rate will rise from that point to that point, and it'll be higher as a result. Now, if you think about those other diagrams, that's going to be a higher interest rate, and so it's going to mean there's less investment, less consumption, and less net exports, because each of those depends negatively on the interest rate. You don't even have to worry too much about a diagram at this point, because we know that those other components, the diagram for consumption, investment, and net exports, they will show that all of those should decline because they depend negatively on the interest rate. So you can apply this same approach. So as illustrated in this diagram, we can sum the three demand curves horizontally to get the total demand for consumption, investment, and net exports as a share of GDP. And that's shown over on the far right, that sum by the red line. Now what we also want to do is think of that graph over on the right as kind of a supply and demand curve. The red line is a demand curve because it shows how the interest rate negatively affects the quantity demanded of consumption, investment, and net exports, again as a share of GDP. The supply curve most naturally is what is available in a supply sense to spend on investment, consumption, and net exports. What is available? Well, what's available is what's left over after the government share is decided, after G over Y is decided, and what's left over from that is what's available for the private sector. So the blue line, that vertical line, represents that. It's meant to be vertical because we're assuming that government's decision about how much to spend depends on things like national defense or other kinds of security measures, diplomatic services, which not naturally depending on the interest rate. It made it a little bit, but we're assuming it's very small and draw it vertically. So the intersection of these two curves, just like a supply and demand curve gives you a price, the intersection of these two curves is going to give you the interest rate. If the interest rate is not at the intersection of those two lines, it will adjust either upward and downward. So you bring the quantity demanded of C plus I plus X into equilibration with the quantity supplied as represented by the blue line. The blue line here, for example, might be drawn at 80%. If it's a share of GDP, if the government takes 20% as a share of GDP for its spending purposes. And note, once you've got the interest rate on the right-hand side diagram, you can then draw a line across at that interest rate to find out what exactly is consumption as a share of GDP, what exactly is investment as a share of GDP, and finally what exactly net exports, X, are as a share of GDP. And that's illustrated in this diagram as well. So we can focus on the right-hand side of that diagram. That's kind of like the supply and demand diagram. Just put it by itself. Now it looks like something we've seen in the past, downward sloping demand and a vertical, in this case, supply curve. Left over, that's what's left over after government purchases have been decided. Intersection giving the interest rate, and then we can examine what will happen as one of these curves shifts, either the red or the blue, just as we examine what happens to a price when a demand curve or a supply curve shifts. So that's what we want to do. And let's consider the case where the curve shifts because of an increase in government purchases as a share of GDP. So consider the effects of this increase in G over Y. We want to focus on the long run effects. With this kind of a model, it's designed for longer run issues, say 5 years or a decade. I'm not really quite sure how long it has to be, but we'll consider different examples. So the effects have to be more permanent or long-lasting. It's not just 1 or 2 year increase, temporary increase in government purchases. It's a more permanent one, maybe a shift in priorities to more defense or whatever it happens to be. So now we take that same diagram and shift the supply curve over to the left in this case, because more government purchases means there's less left over for the private sector, as illustrated here. And you can see now the original interest rate, which is at the intersection of the demand-supply curve, has now moved up to this new intersection. That new intersection reflects the fact there's got to be higher interest rates. There's lower amount available for the private sector, so somehow their incentives have to be aligned, and those incentives are aligned by a higher interest rate, which reduces their consumption, net exports, and investment to bring it in line with the available funds after the government share has been determined. So that's the higher interest rate, which comes out of this supply and demand diagram very easily. But also note, just thinking about it, that this means there's going to be lower investment, consumption, and net exports because the interest rate is higher. And you can illustrate that with this animated diagram, which is this same form. On the right, we have that supply and demand diagram again. And we start off by shifting it to the left with more government purchases, meaning there's less available for the C plus I plus X. That gives you a new interest rate, as you can see in the diagram, a higher interest rate. And that higher interest rate means there's a higher interest rate for investment, consumption, and net exports as well. And so that higher interest rate is going to move you along all of those curves, all the three curves, the consumption, investment, and net exports. And as a result, you'll see that the quantities, the shares of consumption, investment, net exports all decline because of interest rate. Sometimes that's called crowding out. The larger government share means there's got to be less as a share of the others by definition, and that's the crowding out. So that's how it works. Now, you can consider the reverse of this. Here's the supply and demand diagram again. And in this case, if you had a decline in government purchases, it would shift this to the right, tend to reduce the interest rate, and that would have the reverse effects on consumption, investment, and net exports. Same logic following exactly, just move the curve in the other direction, interest rate falls. Now, you can also consider other things in this model. You can consider shifts in the demand curve, not just supply. So you can have a demand curve shifting out. That could shift out because either there's more consumption demanded, investment demanded, or net exports demanded at any given interest rate. Depends on which it is, what's going to happen, but they all could shift. And in this case, you're going to get a higher interest rate. It's illustrated in the diagram. We have an intersection which moves from that original point to the new point, and you get a higher interest rate as a result. So that's a pretty straightforward observation as well. You also can have the reverse, of course. You can have demand curves shifting to the left. That's going to generate a lower interest rate. Just as you study the diagram, it's clear, and that lower interest rate is going to decrease the amount of consumption, investment, and net exports. It's going to have a change in those quantities as well. The lower interest rate is going to have a reversal effect on those quantities. Its demand may have shifted down for consumption. If it didn't shift for investment, then the lower interest rate would have encouraged more investment. We'll have to trace this out with particular diagrams, particularly looking at the consumption, investment, and net export diagrams. And so why don't we just go ahead and do that rather than just try to think about it in our heads. So there's a diagram, by now familiar, C plus I plus X, sums to the total non-government owes to shared GDP. That's the red line. We got the supply by the blue line. Now let's suppose there's a shift in investment demand. It's one of those things we talked about. So we illustrate in the diagram by shifting the investment curve over to the right a little bit, so the demand for investment is less at every interest rate. Okay, and then we can go over to the right and shift the red curve by the same amount, since that's the sum of the three. We're going to have a prediction with that at that higher amount of demand that the interest rate's going to rise. So there it goes up from that cross to this cross. And at that higher interest rate, we're going to go over and say, oh, net exports has gone down, consumption's gone down, and there's going to be a movement along the demand curve for investment, and as it's drawn here, it may have started at that point over there, shifted over, and even with this change in interest rates, it's moved over to that point there. So we have a prediction what happens to consumption, investment, and net exports. You can do this kind of thing for all sorts of shifts. So we just considered investment. What about consumption? Well, consumption might be a shift in consumption demand. Maybe something in the economy makes people want to consume more. So that maybe they're richer. They have the stock market boom, so they feel like spending more. You can show that graphically by shifting the consumption, the one over on the far left in this diagram. And when you shift that consumption and then sum over all three, you get a shift in the total, the red line, by the same amount. Going through the same logic, that's going to make the interest rate rise. So interest rate rises, and as a result, you'll have less net exports going down. As a result of that, you're going to have less investment because of the higher interest rate going in that direction. And there's some ambiguity about what happens for the amount of consumption, because that's shifted over, but then the higher interest rates have tended to make people want to consume less on that account as well. So it's sort of two effects. One, the shift in consumption, which goes positive, and then the movement along the curve, which is negative. And in this, as it's drawn in the diagram, there's still an increase in consumption as a share of GDP, not as much as the size of the shift. And finally, just to maybe not belabor the same point, but one more time, what about net exports? Maybe the demand for U.S. exports shifts up for some reason because of the rest of the world doing better, wanting to buy more U.S. exports. Or maybe the reverse, the U.S. Consumers want to import a lot more from abroad, so net exports could decline on that basis. Well, we can use the same kind of diagram to illustrate this. Let's consider the case where net exports fall. So that's the diagram with X over Y represented. In this case, as it's shown in the diagram, this shifts over to the left. That means less net exports, and again, that could be because people are demanding less exports from the U.S. at any given interest rate, any given exchange rate. And what is the implication going to be? Well, we have to shift over the total in the red line by the same amount. That's going to get to a new intersection point, a new equilibrium with a lower interest rate. And then we go over and find out what happens. Well, consumption is going to increase somewhat. Investment is going to increase somewhat. And we have these countervailing effects with respect to net exports because it shifted down a little bit, but then with a lower interest rate, it's come back a little bit from where it was at the shift in the curve. Now remember, very important, when you think about net exports, the mechanism, going back to the microeconomic foundations of this, the mechanism for net exports involves that chain of reasoning, where in this case a lower interest rate tends to lower the dollar, and that makes net exports higher than it otherwise would be. So you have a shift down, but it comes back because of that lower interest rate and a lower dollar. So the lower interest rate affects not only consumption and investment, but also net exports, and that's illustrated very clearly in this diagram. So what we've seen here is just based on the fundamentals of consumption, investment, and net exports, that they are shares of GDP, and when you add in government purchases, you get all of GDP. And then we're thinking about consumption, investment, net exports, all depending negatively on interest rate. We have good economic reasons for that, and as we'll see later, there's empirical evidence for that. You can see it in the markets all the time. And so we have a theory that hangs together from a theoretical point of view, of the microeconomic rationale, and has empirical justified. Now we're going to use it to make predictions of what actually would happen in the economy under these circumstances, always making analogies back not only to the microeconomic theory, but to these simple microeconomic diagrams like supply and demand. Thank you very much.